he was clean. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I have to say, it's pretty brave of Chris to sign up to be a lay reader this month when there's going to be lots and lots of names, right? Because Bible names are the best. Well, we're starting off with the story of Naaa-who. So Naaman and Elisha. Now, this is happening during the time that Israel is ruled by kings. And we've talked about this before multiple times, that the kings of Israel, for the most part, were not particularly good at their jobs. Right? I mean, and most of the time, they came into power, they did not great things, and then somehow they got themselves removed from power by various means. Now, while this thing is going on, like while all this succession of kings, God hasn't completely abandoned everybody, because while the kings are trying to do what they're doing and not being very good at it, there's the succession of prophets. And Elijah is one of those prophets, and he would have a ministry in Israel that would actually span the reigns of about 4 different kings, 3 of which were terrible. Including the one that is in power during this story. So what ends up happening is people generally recognize that these kings that they've got running around aren't particularly great. But so people start to turn to other folks. And one of the things they turn to are these series of prophets. And so it's no wonder that when this young Israelite woman who has been captured by somebody, by one of their neighbors, starts talking about the amazing things that God is doing in Israel, she doesn't talk about the amazing things God is doing through the kings in Israel, talks about the amazing things God is doing through this prophet Elijah in Israel. Now, Aram is next door to Israel, and they are not on friendly relations. In fact, most people in this area are not on friendly relations. They are constantly fighting with each other over things like water and land and stuff like that, and Aram is one of those. And so you've got this guy who is a general in this army, or in this country, and because he's a person of high status and position, when they do capture some folks, he is one of the ones who gets to receive one of these servants. Not just anybody gets one of these. So we know he's an important person. We know he's a person of power. He's a person of privilege. But he has a problem. Now, when we read in the Old Testament the word leprosy, you need to understand that that is kind of code for really any skin condition. Right? Like there is no generally agreed upon diagnosis definitions, right? Like you're not going into your hospital management system and entering the correct diagnosis code for the various skin conditions, right? Like that doesn't exist, right? If you have something wrong with your skin, then you have leprosy. Now, whether you actually have leprosy or you just have dry skin or what it is, they didn't know. So we're not quite sure exactly what was wrong with him. It wasn't so bad that he couldn't, work and he couldn't be. But it was obviously noticeable and it was obviously problematic. And he's probably spent some time trying to figure out some sort of treatment for what's wrong with him. So when he, this great important person, hears that there's somebody who might be able to help him, he gets permission from really the only person above him, which is his king, to go and find out. So he leaves and he takes all this stuff with him because he thinks he's going to deal with another king, right? And when you deal with another king or another leader, right, you have to play honor to them, right? So he knows he just can't show up there, right? Like that's not how it works. So he's got to come, and so he brings all this silver and this gold and this clothing and all this wealth with him in order to basically pay tribute to the king and hope that he's going to do whatever it is that he can do. Now, the king in Israel is, again, not one of the better ones and is fairly convinced that this is all just a big trick, right? So I'm going to send somebody to you, give them an impossible task, and then use this as a pretext to either attack or invade later. That is exactly what the king thinks is going to happen. Because he's like, I don't know what to do with this. So Naaman, but of course Elisha figures it out and says, no, bring him to me. And I love this scene. Because Naaman is this big, important guy. He's been struggling with something. He wants something to change in his life. He's looking pretty much for a miracle. And he has decided in his brain already what a miracle should look like. Right? That's what he did. He figured it out. He's like, oh, I'm going to go and maybe like the clouds will come over and there'll be lightning and maybe like all kinds of crazy stuff will happen and this important guy will come out probably with like flowing robes, right? I mean, you can picture in your head what you expect this to look like. So Naaman's built this whole thing up in his head, and he goes and he finally gets to the person he's supposed to talk to, and the person he's going to talk to doesn't even leave the house to talk to him. Did you notice? He just sends another servant to say, hey, have you tried taking a bath? Now, it's somewhat understandable that Naaman might be a little insulted by this, right? He's like, obviously, bathing, I had considered it. But he is expecting one thing, and then the thing that he is offered just seems too simple, right? His pride is getting in the way. He's a big, important person with a difficult problem that's going to need some kind of like complex, difficult, hard solution. And Elijah says, why don't you go down to the river and have yourself a bath? We kind of fall into this. We continue to be a people who I think really likes complex solutions, right? When we are facing problems, we like to assume that whatever the response is, whatever the right thing to do is going to be hard and difficult. And we struggle sometimes when the answer turns out to be far simpler than we want it to be. And there are no end of stories about this, but I got two for you. And so the first one is the name of a doctor. And this doctor, I'm going to get it wrong. Semmelweis. We'll go with that. So Semmelweis, he's a Hungarian doctor in 1846. And he starts his kind of like internship at the time. They kind of did that in Vienna. And he's in the maternity ward. And he notices something right away. Is that if you're a woman and you come in there to this maternity ward to give birth, about half of the folks end up with the doctors and the soon-to-be doctors in that ward, and about half of the folks end up in a ward that is actually handled by women and midwives. And what he notices right away, and whatever other people had noticed but chose not to see, is that the women who were giving birth in the place with the midwives and the other women were doing far better than the ones who were giving birth on the side with the doctors and the future doctors. Right? And especially when it came to this thing called childbed fever, which was at the time the leading cause of death amongst women who recently gave birth. Well, the rates for people contracting this with the doctors on their side of the building was 5 to 10 times greater than with the midwives. And so he set about to figure out why. And he didn't know why. It wasn't immediately clear why. So he started to look and make comparisons about what are they doing versus what's happening over here, happening over there. And he first thing he notices that, well, when the women give birth on the midwife side, they do it on their sides. And when they do it with the man's side, they do it on their backs. So let's switch and have everybody do it on their sides and see if that makes a difference. It made no difference whatsoever. None. And so he's like, okay, that's not it. And then he figured out that, when something does happen and something does go wrong and they have to bring the priest in, the priest comes in and rings this really loud bell. Really, they knew nothing back then, apparently. But he only does it on the doctor's side, so maybe we'll have him not do that anymore. Like, don't come in and don't ring the really loud bell because you're literally scaring these poor women to death. That was his theory. Sure. So he gets the priest to not ring the bell anymore, and he changes what goes on, and they're like, and of course that makes no difference. And he gets upset, and then he leaves for a while, and he has to take a break because he can't figure out what's going on. And while he's gone, one of his colleagues, who is also a male doctor in training, actually dies of childbed fever. He's like, well, how does that work? But this guy was a pathologist, and so he studied these things. And eventually what he kind of figures out is the one thing that's happening on the doctor side that isn't happening on the midwife side, is on the doctor side is after people pass away, they're trying to figure out what's going on, so they're performing autopsies on the people who pass away, so they can figure out why they did that. The doctors do that, and the midwives don't. And so somehow he'd put it together in his brain that something that's happening, something is being moved between these people who have passed away and the new women who are coming into this place to give birth. And the only thing that's moving between those two are the doctors. So maybe it's us. And maybe, and this is a radical idea that he has in 1846, maybe we should wash our hands. Or at least wash our hands a little better than we're doing now. And he develops this protocol where they'd wash their hands, and they actually wash their hands with something that we would know today is kind of an antiseptic thing. And sure enough, as soon as they start doing this, the rates of childbed fever amongst the women on all the sides decline dramatically. And then, of course, so all the doctors went, good job, we're all going to start doing this now. Not at all. That's not at all what they did. And in fact, at first, the doctors didn't like it because they said, well, what are you saying? This is our fault? This can't be our fault. It's not our problem. We didn't do this. And there's this massive resistance. So in 1846, we figured out that you should probably wash your hands when you're dealing with sick people, but it's going to be several decades later before it becomes widespread practice after this guy is dead. Because the answer just seemed too simple. We didn't like what it meant. There must be something else going on, something more complicated. How many women died? Because the answer to the problem just seemed too easy. All right, so I have another example, and I'm glad somebody brought up sports. So we're going to talk about Wilt Chamberlain real quick. So Wilt Chamberlain is famous for a lot of things. One of the things that Wilt Chamberlain is famous for, though, is he's the first person to ever have a 100-point game, right? This was a little before my time, I will confess. But I've heard about it, and we have Wikipedia. So in 1962, Wilt Chamberlain has this amazing game where he actually scores 100 points. Never been done in history before. Now, interestingly enough, in that year, that season, 1961-1962 season for Wilt Chamberlain, he did something that season that he had never done before, and he'd never done after. And the thing that he did is he worked with somebody who helped him work on his free throws, because this is a really big deal. Now, I'm out of my element. I don't know basketball. I know enough to know there's a thing called free throws. I think you stand on a line and you get 2 points, right? Yeah, okay. I don't know everything. So anyway, but he works with this guy who helps him work on his free throws, and he goes from having about a 35% free throw throwing percentage to a 65% free throw throwing percentage, which is a pretty big deal. And he makes all but 3 of his free throws in this game. And frankly, he would not have had a 100-point game. He would not be as famous as he is for having had a 100-point game if he had not improved his free throws. After this season, he stopped doing the thing that he did that made him such a good free throw thrower. Free throw thrower. Wow. There you know that. Why? Does anybody know what he did? He threw it underhand. That's right, which you're apparently allowed to do, but nobody does. Why? Because we call it the granny shot, right? That's its name, right? That's the announcers will announce that you have done this. There was a guy in the early 60s who realized that, just the basic mechanics of throwing a ball are far easier and far more controllable underhand than overhand. And he pioneered this idea and really tried to popularize it for years. His son is still continuing to this day to play and try to popularize this method. And he can't get anybody to take him up on it, even though it works, and it works really, really well. Because we don't like the way that it looks. And it doesn't seem to be, it just looks too easy, right? It's too easy a solution. It's better to shoot in a worse way and just practice more, I guess. I don't know. But we do this. We do this all the time, right? We think that the right answer must be somehow the most complicated, the most difficult answer, when oftentimes the right answer is actually the simplest answer. Nice timing, well done. Naaman is an important person who thinks he deserves an important solution to his problem. But in order to get where he gets, he first has to listen to a slave in his household. And then when he's so mad that he wants to leave because he's not getting what he thinks he gets, it's actually his servants that talk him into trying it. Naaman gets what he wants, and he does actually have to do something hard. But the hard thing he has to do is not the thing he expected to do. The hard thing he had to do is he had to humble himself. He had to humble himself. He had to say, well, okay, maybe the answer was looking me in the face the whole time. He had to swallow his pride and do this thing that God was asking him to do. Our pride gets in the way a lot. Sometimes the thing that we need to do is the simple thing in front of us. I have folks that come and they want to talk to me about marriage and things going on in life, and one of the first questions I ask is, well, how much time do you spend together? And what do you do? Do you have fun together, or are you just getting together to pay bills and run errands? Though errands can be fun. I've had many a date at Costco. It's good times. Dane's nodding her head somewhere, I'm sure. Are you spending time together? People, I don't know how many times I run into people and they just look so tired all the time, but I'm like, okay, well, when are you going to bed? Are you sleeping enough? Right? Like, well, that can't be it. And I'm like, well, actually, human beings don't work very well if we don't sleep enough. Right? And then oftentimes, and I've run this in my life, when we have the things going on, we're not sure what to do, and there's all these options in front of us. One of the things that I have to remind myself constantly when I'm facing one of those things where I'm not sure what to do and what the right path is, I have to take a step back and go, Jeremy, have you prayed about this? Have you spent some time talking to God about this? Have you been so wrapped up in the what ifs and what if this and what if that, and so overwhelmed by the complexity of the whole thing that you haven't taken a step back and just asked the very basic question, God, what do you think I should do? Where would you have me go? Where can I best be your disciple in this place? We like to overcomplicate things. And frankly, the church is as guilty of it as anybody. And the church, our mission is actually really basic. We are in the people development business. That's our job. We help people learn to love God, love neighbor, and love themselves. If what we are doing feeds into that, supports that, then we're doing the right thing. It's a very simple, basic, profound, earth-shattering question. I don't know how many other clergy I've met when they talk to me about all the stuff that they're trying to do, or this isn't working, or that isn't working, and I ask the very basic question, how are you helping people learn to love God, love neighbor, and love themselves? How does this help with that? And if it is, and if you are, then great. But if not, then maybe you need to rethink it. we need to recognize that what God offers to us, what God offered to Naaman, what God offers through Elijah, what God offers to everybody, is actually really simple. God has created us to be God's children. God asks for something very simple in return, that we practice one thing over and over and over again: loving God, loving our neighbor, and loving ourselves. So much so that we in this church come back to this table back here every month to remind us how simple it is. It comes in the form of something as basic as it gets: a little bit of bread and a little bit of juice. You can see that how you want to see it. How I choose to see it is this opportunity to experience God's grace. Not in a flashy way, not in a hard way, not in a complicated way, but in an intentionally very simple way. Because at the end of the day, it's actually pretty simple. We are God's children. We are loved by God. God wants us to love others the way that we've been loved. When we are doing that, we are the church, and we are the church that God has created and that God wants us to be. Amen.